right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session. We have got an exciting 50 minutes of conversation ahead of us here. My name is Daniel Cruz. I will do my best to gently steer what should be a dynamic conversation. We've got some experts with us here to talk about a really pressing and important issue, this understanding and this concept, systemically important critical infrastructure and where that intersects with cybersecurity. So if you've come to the right place this morning, thanks for joining us. As mentioned, we've got some great panelists with a well of knowledge from their careers, Norma Cram, Bob Kolaski, and Henry Willis. So let's just dive right into it. Norma, starting with you, you have an impressive career of public service, over 20 years in the executive branch, I think 4 different cabinet level agencies you have served at in senior levels. And now in your role in Van Scoyoc Associates leading their cyber practice, you work with a range of different companies of all shapes and sizes across all critical infrastructure sectors, helping advise them on how they can navigate this landscape here. So from that vantage point, based on that experience, when have you sort of seen a shift? Are these companies just going from caring about cyber, managing their cyber risks, protecting their systems, to this notion that there's actually systemic risk that they might need to manage as well? Talk us through that evolution a little bit.
Thank you, Daniel, and it's great to be here to talk about my favorite topic in the whole wide world, critical infrastructure. You know, it is interesting because when I started my cyber practice, when I left the government, having worked on what we call our continuity of operations and planning, continuity of government, which is basically our war gaming, the what if, it was clear to me that cybersecurity was the next risk. But that was in 2005, and I will tell you in 2005 it was very tough to really help most sectors understand what was cyber risk, let alone systemic risk. We did start to see kind of this evolution and change though in, I would say 2010. It took a few years. Certainly early sectors like defense understood that systemic risk because they were in the national security space. But in 2010 we actually had the Dodd-Frank Act, which included the ability for one of the agencies, the Treasury Department, to actually designate, right? We talk about all these designations, systemically important financial institutions. Now, the financial services sector, heavily regulated for everything, including cyber, for a long time. But I would say you hit around 2013, I know we're gonna talk about this, when there was a very important executive order that talked about that issue. I'll just say this, there are cultures within different sectors that have driven them to either understand cyber risk or systemic cyber risk. If you think about certain sectors like energy, communications and others, they understood that risk, but we've had slower culture changes actually in sectors that are heavily regulated for safety. And I'm just gonna say this and we'll move on. Transportation, health, others, they have been regulated for safety for so long, they think that covers cyber. And we've gotten to a place where it's much slower for them to understand safety is not cybersecurity, and that systemic risk could mean injuries, fatalities, or complete loss of the function of the sector itself.
Excellent. Well, sounds like a lot to pull the thread on here over the next 50 minutes or so in that evolution and where we're at. Bob, over to you. You've got an impressive background and resume in the critical infrastructure risk management space, perhaps with a small blip when you were my boss, but on the whole, the resume is quite impressive. We're 15 years at DHS, really on the front lines of some of the more consequential advancements in terms of the way that government is thinking about critical infrastructure resilience. You stood up the National Risk Management Center at CISA just shortly after CISA became CISA. So you obviously have been on the front lines quite a bit here. When you look back, and now obviously in your perch as a senior leader at Exeger thinking about supply chain resilience, when you look back over those last 15 plus years, what are the advancements in systemic cyber risk management that you are particularly proud of where government and industry came together? And where do you kind of look back and say, gee, I wish we had marshaled more, and this is the opportunity for us going forward?
Thanks, Daniel, and great to be with all you and with Norma and Henry. Appreciate the kind words. You know, like Norma, sort of looking at perspective of where we were in the 2000s to where we are now in the way we think about cyber risk and critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure started very much as an asset-heavy focus, and the whole sort of rise of government policy around critical infrastructure was to protect critical infrastructure in the face of terrorism risk, and 9/11, which was a terrorist attack using critical infrastructure against critical infrastructure that caused billions, trillions of dollars of damage, endless wars, and unfortunately, losses of life. And so the first job around critical infrastructure protection was let's protect the assets. that's not the right way to think about cybersecurity for critical infrastructure for cybersecurity, especially from the perspective of a national perspective. Instead, you've got to think about systems and networks and protecting essentially functions, critical functions. And work I did in the government and the work continued to think conceptually was building risk models within the government to think about the things that are most important from a national security, national economic security, economic competitive perspective around the idea of national critical functions. Conducting elections, the availability of potable water, operating core communications networks, providing transportation, core transportation. And it is in the interest of systemic risk is the responsibility of the government to think about things that are systemically risky to our communities, to our citizenry, and the likes. And defining and doing building risk models to understand those functions, and then navigating and understanding of how cyber vulnerabilities in certain systems can contribute to loss of functions for things that you're interested in. That was the perspective from the government. I'm no longer with the federal government at this point. It's the same perspective that businesses need to take, right? And you hear that often here. It's what are the cyber risks to my systems? And so, what I'm doing right now, the company I work at, Exeger, is looking at supply chain vulnerabilities that can cause risks to systems that exist through your third parties who you're doing business with to your core essential functions. That theory works at the federal level. It works all the way down to the business level. Think about cybersecurity from the things that are the key core assets, understand your systems, and understand where those vulnerabilities get entered into the systems.
Excellent insight there, and I know the work you did at CISA to develop that functional approach to risk, national critical functions, going to be implicit in a lot of these cyber risk management conversations for decades to come. Good segue, last but not least, as we kick things off here, over to Henry Willis, who's been a senior researcher at RAND for over 20 years, has really been on the front lines of analyzing some of the thorniest critical infrastructure resilience challenges, helping advise policymakers over the last 2 decades here. Henry, as we sort of wind up the opening act of this conversation here, we've heard a lot about systems of systems and interconnectedness. From your vantage point, how implicit to any conversation about managing systemic cyber risk is just taking a step back and understanding the interconnectedness, systems of systems that underpin our entire digital way of life?
Thank you, Daniel, and thanks for everyone to come participate in this session with us. It's really been interesting for me to be at my first RSA conference. I don't consider myself a cyber expert. I have done research on risk analysis, and from that perspective, there's kind of 2 principles that I bring forward when I think about this issue of how should we think about interconnectedness. One of the risk management principles is the riskiest thing to do is to take no risk at all. I'll come back to that. The second is that when we think about managing this risk, we need to think about it holistically. Everything of the risk process, from exposure through even how we perceive and think about the consequences. So what does that mean for interconnectedness? I would posit, and I think I've heard this from many of you throughout the conference, the goal of security is not to close all the vulnerabilities that exist. It's to enable the benefits of digital connectivity. And how do we think about doing that so that we can get the benefits of greater economic activity, more prosperous, more features on our iPhones, all the good things. And to do that, we have to think not just about responding to attacks when they happen and recovering from them. We also have to think about changing the exposure, either by design or by actions of those who would attack us. And we also have to think about how we perceive and react to the consequences. I think in work with you, Bob, and Daniel, when we thought about the election in 2020, in some sense the systems functioned, but there was a loss of confidence in them. And we see that in other systemic issues also. The oil pipeline, Colonial Pipeline, there was panic buying in areas that there need not be panic buying in. So if you don't, even if you have a secure system, if you don't have confidence in it, you can have risk.
Excellent. Well, I think that sort of these opening scene setters here, you've all demonstrated, why your background is valuable to this conversation. We are going to get to a part in a few minutes here where we might actually have a little bit of feisty, healthy debate. But before that, maybe a quick hitting question where I think we have consensus and maybe self-evident, but let's see here. So my question is, does cybersecurity represent systemic risk to the nation? Norma, starting with
Absolutely.
you.
Cybersecurity is the number one systemic risk to the way we live, run, and function our lives every single day.
Bob?
Let's expand on that. There are a couple particular areas that it threatens systemic risk. One is an attack on something that's critically important in a way that there's lots of functionality that cascades, right? And so let's posit that there's a possibility of an attack which causes loss of power for a couple days in some area. And what is the cascading impact on a system from loss of power? What's the cascading impact on an attack on a financial institution where you lose the ability to clear payments on that? And so when we worked with critical infrastructure companies in the government, those were the sorts of systemic risk issues we first and foremost focus. Let's make sure the grid's secure, let's make sure financial institutions are, because that can be systemic. But the other aspect of systemic risk is an attack on a core technology that a lot of institutions rely on that doesn't necessarily
Right.
cascade across the system. So it's not a contagion across the system, but it's a common vulnerability, common attack on a cloud provider, for example, and a lot of the customers who rely on the cloud provider, and that starts to cause
But I want
harm to the system.
to add one piece to that. Sorry, Henry. I think if we have to make sure that people understand that cyber is a systemic risk. Period. Full stop. Right. And then I think if you can get them to that, whether it's the front end or the back end, to either explain what Bob is just saying, or even just the acknowledgement, that if you can get to that point, then you have the value to be able to then engage on how to address it. But there are still some who don't see it as a systemic risk. And to Bob's point, drilling into that, and I know we're going to talk about that, is what's critical.
I'm still putting Bob as a yes on that answer.
I know.
I'm going to be sure, but not the way people have been talking about it. And it's obvious. Digital connectivity has led to ways we use things, but it also created targets that people can attack us and kind of make us suffer. And so yes, it is a source of systemic risk, but systemic risk isn't new. There's lots of systemic risks. They are those risks that involve multiple actors that affect us in many ways. Like Norma, you said the many ways cyber risk could be exploited. And they can't be solved by one person. And so whether it's financial sector, healthcare systems, power grids, there's all sorts of systemic risk. And I think that means for us, I heard in one of the other sessions, we need to get the CISO a voice in the systemic risk. I think that's right. But we also need to bring the voice of systemic risk management into the security community, because I think, as I talked about in the first answer, there's some lessons there that we can pull from systemic risk management that can help us think about how to address the aspects of this linked to digital connectivity.
Excellent. So I think we're all generally in agreement of the problem that needs to be solved collectively here. Henry, I want to keep it with you. So if we generally agree on the problem, then it becomes how do we understand and dissect the problem, and ultimately what do we do from a risk management perspective? From the understanding and dissecting, you spent 20 years looking at data sets for a variety of different infrastructure resilience challenges. If we agree that there is systemic risk out there, walk us through what is the current understanding, availability of data? What do we have at our fingertips to begin to dissect and add granularity to our understanding of that versus just recognizing that it exists at sort of an anecdotal level?
Well, this is why I've come to RSA to learn more about this. I have, over the last 5-10 years, been trying to understand as much as I could about digital connectivity, information technology, operational technology, to understand what's going on and how we can apply risk management. I think we don't know a lot right now, or there's a lot we don't know. For example, some of the catastrophe modeling firms that try to understand what the big risks are that could affect our systems don't include scenarios that talk about the physical or infrastructure disruptions from exploitation of digital connectivity. We need data that really helps us understand truly, without blind spots, what are the threats that attack this? What is the map of our systems to which these people are attacking, and what's that landscape look like? And if we try to do stuff to address it, how effective and in what ways are different mitigation measures against different types of exploits? We've got lists of this stuff, but we don't have empirical evidence the same way we do in other areas, and we'll talk about that a bit later.
Can I just, we don't have empirical evidence. We've been saying that for a long time. Why don't we have empirical evidence at this point in terms of systemic cyber risk? What are some barriers to sorry, Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, I think
That's a great question.
one of the barriers we come up at this from researchers is a lot of the data right now is being held by all of you and not shared in public ways. There also aren't there might be a role for the government to actually help collect, collate, and deliver some of this data the way it does in other types of sectors as well. And that's not happening.
So pulling that thread just for 1 second, Bob, I think it was 3 years ago at RSA, actually in 2020, the National Association of Corporate Directors released their Cyber Risk Management Handbook. You wrote the foreword to that, and in that foreword, you talked about how we can't use this crutch of this is a too hard to quantify problem. At some point, the lack of decimal place specificity can't be what we just point to as the reason we just are going to spin in circles and can't actually narrow in on targeted risk management scenarios. Henry talked about how much we don't know. It sounds like you think we at least know enough to directionally be targeted here.
But before we answer the question, who's the we? The United States government or owners and operators of critical infrastructure?
And to my, can I jump in?
Yeah.
I would say the we is our public society. These are risks that affect us all, and we need to understand it. There's two criticisms that I've heard of saying why we shouldn't have that. One is, this is my data, how are you going to use it? A second is, well, if I share it, it could be used and it shows vulnerabilities, and I need to keep that close so people don't attack. I mean, those are legitimate points, but you can say those things about other areas where we walk a fine line and find ways to get public benefit from sharing and not reveal recipes for attack.
So trying to knit this together, the we here is there's a general public interest in things that cause systemic risk to your business interest, to your communities, to things that are national imperatives. And we all have some interest in that being true. I'm going to talk about where I see a specific source of systemic risk, which I mentioned are cloud service providers. In addition to my work at Exeter, I'm doing a study at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace that the CSPs are actually, the hyperscalers are participating in, where we're trying to understand the systemic risk within cloud computing and how, what's going on in the cloud. All of us probably in this room touch things that we rely on that the CSPs provide or platform as service, software as service, and where is that risk? Now, netting that back to your question, I don't know that we're ever going to quantify that risk in a meaningful term that we can all believe in exactly, and that should not be the goal for risk management. That should not be, we shouldn't make that necessary to do systemic risk management, right? We have to posit scenarios, and this is how kind of I'm thinking about the CSPs. You got to posit scenarios where there's a failure of service that causes certain things to happen, and what are the implications further down the line from the fact that there's lack of availability or there's lack of confidence, lack of integrity with the availability of cloud services. We can argue whether that's feasible from a security perspective or not. We can argue how much vulnerabilities are. We can have a debate over the likelihood of an adversary taking advantage of that, all the stuff that you would want to do good risk analysis. Or you could posit some of that's happening, do scenario planning, do contingency planning, and work through and stress test the system. And Norma, I mean, going back to your financial examples at the beginning, what is the version of cyber stress testing that needs to happen on things that are systemically important so that we have confidence that if something breaks, the system isn't going to collapse?
But I think what's important here is that we potentially distinguish between the need for increased data analytics, which I think is certainly accurate, right? When we say the we, the problem with those who used to work in the government is sometimes we say the royal we, and we mean, our old hats. We're all in the private sector now. The second piece, though, is we need to look at each critical infrastructure sector or national critical functions or whatever term makes you happy to better understand where can cyber risk impact the functionality, delivery of service, or potentially impact loss of life. That is very different in every sector. The banking financial services sector, I actually run a CISO council for all the card brands, global payment processors and banks, and they understand that, right? Systemic risk in that industry is much clearer, and there's already, in fact, mutual aid in place between a lot of the large banks. But when we think about other sectors like transportation, you have to talk to those sectors in a very different way. If you are an owner and operator of an airline, an airport, a railroad, transit, you know how to run and operate a safe system. What you have to do with them in that case is deconstruct the function, they know how to run it, to understand if they can actually see where those connectivities are that they didn't even know exist. But I think what we need to do is have a specialized approach to each sector, because honestly, when the IT cyber people come, parachuting in to talk to somebody in the OT world or even medical devices, it's clear they don't understand how that sector functions, and people stop paying attention, right? So we have to respect the differences in the sectors and work with them to manage their risk in the appropriate way.
So let me use transportation for a second. A couple months ago, there was the passenger record system that went down. That it was an FAA old IT deficit, as far as I know, that happened. But it was an example of something happening in the digital space that had systemic effects across the aviation system for a day, for 3 days, and people who couldn't fly somewhere because of something probably caused trouble. That's an example in my mind of a systemic risk. To what extent, right, it's going to cascade all the way. But there's a stress test that we actually saw. An IT system failed, not because, as far as we know, there was an attack against the system, but there was an IT system failure. What were the lessons? How can we take lessons like that and get better at managing that sort of risk? And do you think transportation, in this case, the airlines are going to learn from that, the aviation system's going to learn from that, or are we going to keep seeing digital failures that threaten significant economic activity?
I'll just say this, and maybe we can keep going, or Daniel will redirect us. The aviation system is a fascinating example. 21 years post 9/11, and having been the Deputy Chief of Staff at the Department of Transportation, aviation has its own culture. And what we really need is for the Department of Transportation to work with TSA, which is the regulator of record for aviation on physical and cyber, to make sure that they understand how to manage and plan out that risk. Because the difference too in the scaling of a disaster in aviation, we don't need to tell anyone what that looks like. People have to understand what an outage could do to just basic functionality. That might not have been a cyber issue, right? That could have been a basic digital failure. But I think we have to distinguish between cybersecurity managing risk and outcomes. What are the outcomes that we do not want to see? What are the outcomes that could bring the entire economy down and manage the risk? And in the case of aviation, that's where DHS and DOT need to work with the aviation industry. And the last piece I'll just say, aviation is tough because it's such a mix of public and private, right? FAA runs the air traffic control systems, state and local governments run airports, you've got the private sector aviation side, airline side. It's a very tough industry.
I think,
Oh, wait, for Henry.
well, that point you made about outcomes, I think, is critical, and an example of what I don't see us do enough in systemic cyber risk is talk quantitatively about what are those outcomes we can tolerate and what are they can't. It could be talked about in days of outage or months of outage in some scenarios we think about. It could be talked in billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. Where are those thresholds and what are the scenarios that would lead us there?
So that's a good segue, I think, in terms of, Norma, you hit on kind of the need to have more nuance in a sector by sector approach, and Henry, your point about let's define sort of the outcomes, things we want, things we don't want. Up to this point, a lot of the policy activity around managing systemic cyber risk, at least from my vantage point, is what I'll call listless and more lists. This desire to come together, have the government create designations and lists of things, and have that with the belief that that is a basis to then do more from there. Bob, I want to go to you on this one here. You were in government when executive order in 2013 came out that has had a part of that known as the Section 9 list. For the audience here, not to get too deep into presidential executive memorandum, walk us through what that Section 9 list was, what it was supposed to be, what its impact has been, and what that leaves for us to do now, looking back almost a decade later on that.
Sure. The idea of lists of what are critical, again, works for business all the way up to the government. And it's knowing the things, the business relationships that you have, the companies you rely on in your supply chain that are most critical. And I think that's an important concept. At the federal level, what the government's trying to do with 13636, the mandate was to look at critical infrastructure that if a cyber attack successfully happened, had the potential of causing catastrophic impact. and what were the companies that theoretically could be attacked through cyber means that if something happened, there could have catastrophic impact on national security and national economic security. So that executive order asked analysts to come together and create a list of companies where that was theoretically true. There was no judgment of whether it was a plausible risk or not from an attack perspective, but it was from an impact perspective. And what the US government identified at that point were electric utilities, big banks, communications companies, and critically, they did not identify any IT providers because the IT industry had lobbied policymakers to have an exception that you could not identify IT companies as potentially holding catastrophic risk. I think we sit here 10 years later, and that seems like a silly concept that when you're looking at catastrophic risk, you're not identifying IT companies that are ubiquitous, go back to my cloud service providers, who clearly there is the potential that they cause at least in this context systemic risk. And so the government in 2013 produced a list that had no IT providers on it. And so saying we're going to manage catastrophic risk, think about it from a cyber perspective, but we're not going to identify which IT companies, which software, which hardware, which operational technology is most important to the ability to do that. And I think that's the original sin of that executive order and the limits of taking that perspective, and that's where I'd like to see some policy change.
So recognizing the potential shortcomings of that 2013 effort, no matter how well-intentioned it was, there's been a lot of policy interest in creating a new list regime around systemic importance, and a lot of different names and acronyms. SICI has been thrown around in legislative circles in Washington, D.C., systemically important critical infrastructure. SIE, systemically important entities, and I think, Bob, when you were at CISA, PISCES came in at some point as an acronym there.
I hate acronyms. I mean, let's not talk in acronyms, let's talk about concepts.
And primary systemically important entities. And so we've had this recognition that 2013 effort was probably well-intentioned, but probably didn't fully capture the risk landscape accurately. And so there have been a lot of legislative pushes and policy pushes to maybe correct for that. And CISA has said, in the absence of any of those efforts, that they're going to be creating these lists on their own, regardless if they're required by Congress or not. Norma, you have been I'll say a voice of reason in these conversations, recognizing, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that while it is important to have a thoughtful conversation about how these lists can be updated, that we have to think through what is the point of these designations and what it's for. So as these policy debates have been going on that you have been engaged in, what is your advice to policymakers as they sort of try to chart out a path forward in the let's listen and more lists category?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Look, one of the things I think that the private sector gets very frustrated on is when the federal government, and again, I worked in 4 agencies, tries to recreate the wheel, right? That's their perception. The federal government, on the other hand, is trying to say, I need to understand where there is systemic risk because we are worried about what these outcomes are that I mentioned and we've all talked about, because at the end of the day, if something bad happens, the federal government's job is to come back and help. We're at the messy middle place right now. I always believe in being very practical, especially if you're trying to work in a public-private partnership. I'm not positive that creating more lists that owners and operators really don't understand is going to help us do what we need to do. I think if we talk together about that systemic risk and what the outcome is and where we're trying to go, I don't know that creating a new structure is the best. Maybe it is. But I think what owners and operators want to see first is where are the gaps. If we do have all these lists, and we do have all these authorities that the federal government continues to use, tell us what the gaps are. Tell us what's wrong with those existing lists. If the IT sector was given a carve out in the EO, as Bob said, and they were, then that could easily be fixed. I don't think anyone is really questioning whether or not we have systemic risk, and no one is questioning that we need to do something about it. But I think it's easier to come together and maybe work sector by sector to say, where are the gaps? Or when we started designating entities under these different umbrellas, here's what we missed. And I think people will be willing to say, well, if you missed, you're right, you missed that, but here are 3 other ways. The other thing, if you're going to go the legislative route, and sometimes that is a tool to sort of force change quickly, it's really important to create some structure. Why would we pass a bill that has a new category, that it's not clear what it does? Again, how will the data be used? And if you're going to ask the private sector to give the federal government all the data that is very sensitive about operations of their systems, How will you use it and how will you protect it? Again, I think we have a process problem. So I'm going to throw a flag on the process problem. Let's fix the process. I think everybody wants to get where they need to go. But if we keep saying we have like 6,000 lists, let's figure out where the gaps are and what we're going to do with them.
I've heard you mention that regardless how we ultimately shake out on this list process, we need to be thoughtful in sort of the benefits and burdens conversation. If there's a designation that shines a spotlight on an entity or a collection of entities, people obviously start talking about regulation and requirements in terms of the burden. What would be the benefit that organizations, if you could write the legislation or the policy directive, those entities, what are they not receiving in terms of help from the government or other support that would be on the benefit side of that ledger in your ideal world?
I appreciate that. I think that is important to talk about benefits and burdens. You know, right after the executive order was put out, there was a whole conversation about these issues, and that was in 2013. We're still having them 10 years later. One of the things that a lot of the companies who are designated early on have been saying now for 10 years is what they need is timely and actionable intelligence about specific threats to their industry, and then they would know what to do with it, right? We're just talking about some, we think, easy things, but there is a disconnect, or there's a different perception of risk in the intelligence community about what should be shared and when. There are a lot of sectors that can do a great job of protecting themselves. So give them some tools and let them do that. And then the federal government can focus on the assets or the sectors like maybe water, wastewater that have no tools, right? They have no people. They don't have that understanding. And I think, honestly, industry is looking for something easy and simple. Nobody's necessarily looking for, you know, the big guys are not looking for money from the feds, but give them information that they can take their own action on. And then the last thing I'll say is, we had this conversation early on where we said there is this baseline, right? Everybody needs to understand cyber risk. And maybe from here to, you know, up here, this is where companies can protect themselves. But there needs to be a delineation of here, which I call the equivalent of the cyber tank barreling down your door that's a nation state attack that no one can protect against. And that means there need to be plans in place with the government and the private sector about what the government will do to actually help people. I don't think anybody knows that right now.
Can I, you know, on that, there's a lot of discussion when you think about benefits of the immediate. Right? What can you do for me now? And that pushes us towards give us the threat information. But underlying the systemic risk is infrastructure, and infrastructure is a public good. And going back to what I said, what some of our needs are, I think there's some fundamental data that could help us understand what are those risks, how do we fix them so that infrastructure systems can be stronger and can help each other out and support the economy the way infrastructure does. So I think there's a longer term data and analysis that can be supported as well.
Henry, you've studied incentive structures and market failures for 2+ decades and understanding why things happen and why things don't happen in terms of optimal or desired outcomes. If we recognize that there's some element of you know it when you see it, when some entities just have a heightened importance due to their network centrality or economic significance, yet some, as Norma mentioned, maybe clustered in some under-resourced sectors, just aren't doing enough. Where do you see and how do you dissect, what is the breakdown in terms of entities that should be doing more but aren't?
You know, I think it's a bit unfair to say entities aren't doing as much as they could be doing. I sit in this conference and I see many experts that are, and all of you, putting lots of attention into trying to find how your own systems are vulnerable, how to protect them, how to strengthen them. The challenge here is, as we all know, we're only as good as the weakest of our neighbors, and these cyber risks can spread like a contagion. There's an analogy I want to draw on this to another risk, and that is fire. Right? I mean, it used to be that we would be concerned about conflagrations. Right? London burned down, San Francisco burned down. Right? But it doesn't have to be that way. I spent some time in Philadelphia. There was a deliberate approach. Ben Franklin noted that I think his quote was, they wanted the city to be wholesome and never burnt, and they took specific actions. That has evolved. Now we don't worry about conflagrations the same way. We have building sciences. We burn things down, we blow them over, we try to understand all that. And we regularly understand how fires are started. I wonder if there's a way that we could get that so that it's not individuals having to take action, but we can all improve the risk to digital connectivity together.
Bob, did you have something you wanted to add there?
I mean, you're talking about sort of design for resilience in doing the plan and making the investments and having the right incentives to make investments and understanding, right, and creating the climate for that. And I think that's a perfect analogy for systemic risk. I'll keep picking on the flight example that we're saying. You have an FAA system that's key to the airline system functioning that has a huge amount of tech debt. Congress, the FAA has not appropriated the appropriate money to make the updates. And we're sitting, I think one thing we should agree on in systemic risk is when you're sitting on something that's systemically important that hasn't taken the right steps, somebody's got to step in and make sure that happens. In this case, we're talking about a publicly funded thing and what's broken in a congressional budget perspective. But as we're looking at systemically important critical infrastructure, where are there things, software that becomes critically important? SolarWinds, where we see post-haste that the development practices, software development practices of SolarWinds created risk that the Russians were able to take advantage of. That's the whole notion of whether it's lists or identifying things that are most critical. And let's not just assume everyone's doing the right thing. There may be good reasons that somebody's not doing the right thing, but it's not the right thing from a security outcome. SolarWinds did not take the right steps from a security outcome pre the attack against SolarWinds.
And that's SolarWinds is a good example. From what I understand, is it surprised some people how pervasive it was.
Oh yeah.
And I think this is a question and a rightful criticism of some of our past lists, right? How were they generated? We'd come together, people would nominate things, but could we have real criteria about why, in what context, is something critical?
And see hidden things that aren't as easy. Illuminate things that are hidden in the system, because it wasn't somebody was trying to hide the critical importance of SolarWinds. It was that we collectively, and maybe some of you did, maybe some of you did in your networks and how you designed.
But there are gaps in lists, right? We have lists of, as Daniel framed this out, lists of lists of lists. So if the federal government has lists and they know who's on the list, and you can see where the gaps are, and Bob has identified obviously a very large one, fix the gaps, right? We're not talking about cybersecurity as the ubiquitous problem that we're gonna find the silver bullet will be done tomorrow, no one will come to RSA again, because that's not gonna happen. But it's sort of easy to deconstruct. When we say deconstruct the problem for the private sector, let's have the federal government deconstruct the problem of the lists.
But what is a list other than a set of priorities, right? When we make lists all day, this is the priorities of what I want to do today. And so if you're complaining about lists, you're saying, are those the wrong priorities, or should we not have a priority list, or should we have a more dynamic priority process?
I think Henry's point, though, is there's not a lot of transparency. I'm going to use the term owners and operators, because that includes public and private for critical infrastructure. There's not a lot of transparency as to what the criteria has been to put an entity on those lists. And so
that's a transparency of process.
Well, I talked about we have a process problem. If the federal government believes that that is a sort of classified list of criteria, then only they can identify the gaps. But there's still a way to have a conversation with owners and operators to say, we've had these lists, we've been looking at these issues, we've identified these 3 gaps. As you've been looking internally, do you agree with them, do you not? There is a collaborative approach that can get us there.
Unfortunately, just to complexify this a bit, I guess, supposed to simplify with my research, but I don't always do that. There isn't probably one list, right? Why are you on that list? It might be because everyone uses you. It might be because a few people use you, but you're really unique for what you do, and without you, one particular function can't happen. Or maybe because you're really big, and if you go down, that's big in itself. Like a nuclear plant going down is just a big deal.
So I want to pull the thread on the SolarWinds and software supply chain trend, because Bob was talking about identify the gaps and see what we can do to manage it. It seems like there has been a concerted policy trend post-SolarWinds in the software supply chain space. You had an executive order from the president that had a whole section on secure software development practices. We just had a national cyber strategy that put even a bigger spotlight on it. And CISA, just a few weeks ago, had a secure by design and secure by default guidance that came out. So Bob, from your vantage point, if you look at that trend, is this an example where the community here is marshaling the attention and resources to maybe a pocket of systemic risk, software supply chain, the notion that one line of code could be a digital pandemic, so to speak. And is that an example of where we are rallying and marching where we should be?
Yeah, I mean, but it's in response to the fact that software risk has become ubiquitous and has had real world impacts, ransomware and the like and everything. So yes, it's great that we're all talking about making sure we understand critical software, good software development processes, that the open source community and bringing in open source code, that we're bringing transparency through software bill of materials. I'm using the royal we for the Stronger Together RSA community here, not for the government. It's great that that's all happening. Probably created a bunch of systemic risk, and now we're trying to manage that systemic risk. The whole challenge, like any systemic analogy, is are you going to close the gap on that before systems fail? And systems fail obviously depends on what system from a perspective, how much system failure you're allowed to. Arguably, we haven't had a massive systemic attack from a functional perspective using software from a national security perspective, but we've had massive software flaws that have caused massive information leakage and things like that there. And so, great, let's come create an ecosystem, software security, software development that prioritizes security and is dynamic and let's create the incentives to do that, the market incentives, the regulatory incentives to do it. But let's do it.
Norma, another outgrowth of the National Cyber Strategy and other efforts from the executive order, CISA has put out a set of cross-sector cybersecurity performance goals, distilled set of controls from the NIST cybersecurity framework that I think what they're saying there is that recognizing there are nuances across sectors, these are a set of things everyone should do, recognizing the interconnectedness across sectors. If you do nothing else, definitely do these things and you'll be in a better position tomorrow than you are today. You work with a lot of companies across those sectors. How helpful has that guidance been, and how can it be operationalized?
That's a good point. So for the audience, if you haven't looked, you should. There are sort of two sets of cybersecurity performance goals that have been out. There's sort of the ubiquitous ones, generic ones, and then there are some cross-sector ones. The goal is to do sector-specific ones. I think what is important is for those sectors, again, who are not at the level of maturity or sophistication, and they exist, then I think those cybersecurity performance goals will be very helpful to them. Having something that's clear and easy to read, it is not overly complicated, and pulling in the NIST best practices, which they just did, was really useful. Because what we don't need is sort of this divergence between what CISA does and what NIST does, especially in the engineering community of people who understand that. I think ultimately what will be the most important is really those sector-specific cyber performance goals. Sectors that are heavily regulated right now, banking, financial services, for instance, I mean, my opinion only, one will be done for the sector. I'm not sure that they need that quite as much as we have other sectors. But I think trying not to boil the ocean, trying to help sectors who don't really understand this risk, that's where those cyber performance goals will be useful. And for anyone who has or is in a heavily regulated sector, in that regulatory approach, there are performance goals that go underneath that. Safety is sort of the easiest example. And so for those sectors, especially on the OT side, we can show them those analogies, right? Safety performance goals, cyber performance goals, I think that they'll be very useful. But what we don't want is to fall into the trap of, we have cyber performance goals, we're just going to hand it off to a sector and they'll magically understand them and use them. That's where the other parts of the government, the other agencies, I think can be very helpful because, again, we'll pick on transportation. If you speak, there's aviation speak, which is not rail speak, which is not transit speak, or it's not even medical device speak. So we have to make sure that we're communicating in the right way, but using that, I think, as a basis or a foundation is good.
Excellent, great insight there. We have covered a lot of water here over the last 45 minutes. And I appreciate the insight from our panelists. I think we have time for one or two questions, so I want to make sure the audience can get involved here. So I want to thank our panelists here for that dynamic conversation. Thank you.
All right, questions?
There's microphones on.
Quick question. Yes, so you talked about a lot about sectors, but not much about the underlying of those sectors and how much they're moving in their cybersecurity. I heard Bob mention cloud service providers. So, thinking of cloud service providers, what's your thoughts on them being them? I'm saying the underlying technology as a critical infrastructure, and that because the concentration risk there of many of these sectors collaborate or moving into those technologies is a systemic risk. Your
So
thoughts?
I fundamentally agree with that. I wish there was something called systemically important critical infrastructure and that term had meaning, and if it did, that would be at the top of my list of things that are systemically important. I think my company needs to recognize how systemically important our CSPs are to us, and we need to worry about that. I think the national security needs to do that. And I think the cloud companies recognize their level of importance. What you'll see coming out of the national cyber strategy is a debate over, does the government put new requirements to collect information from the cloud service providers or on security or the CSPs to know their customers and things like that? Because I don't think anyone's fighting the concept that CSPs are, particularly hyperscalers, are systemically important critical infrastructure. It goes back to what's the meaning there.
Right.
And do we have enough assurance that because they are systemically important, they're not creating a level of systemic risk, and we need to continue to do the kind of analysis to know that.
But I think we're looking at the I'm going to call it the connective tissue between sectors, right? Cloud, IT, I would argue space, right? Satellite, GPS, PNT. Those are really important.
And I would add, look at supply chains as another source. And I think an interesting discussion here at RSA is software bill of materials as part of that supply chain.
Thank you. My background is DoD, mostly Navy and OT, but some very holistic challenges I came across were cost, asset awareness, and culture. And what we used in one specific major shipbuilding program to overcome those was using the cyber problem to jumpstart technology transformation. Right? We got to give people a reason to want to solve a problem other than spending more money to solve a new problem. So by doing using some existing technology to help people get aware of all their assets to solve the cyber problem, we showed them how that could solve their obsolescence management, configuration management, and their day-to-day duties, which then in turn helped change the culture and helped with the cost. After watching a 60 Minutes episode on critical infrastructure that I'm sure you've all watched at the end of last year, and then speaking at a Public Utilities Commission of Texas conference down there, I learned that you all in this critical infrastructure area have very similar problems. And I guess my question to you is very easy to answer. It's a yes/no question. You could extrapolate as we have time. Are you comfortable after that 60 Minutes episode, what they talked about, that things are moving fast enough with cost, culture change, and asset awareness? Thank you.
I'm going to say this. I think that there have been such a series of events, public cybersecurity events and otherwise, that people understand that that has to change. The culture shift in every sector is going to be harder. And where I think the US government is making clear is that where your culture lags behind in awareness and understanding and action, then you're going to see a regulatory approach. Like, this is no longer going to be, well, you can eventually get there. And I think the US government is also making clear in the secure by design, where liability may sit and the regulatory approach, that it's going to have to push people to move. And I'll say this, I mean, having started my cyber practice with critical infrastructure in 2005, as I like to say, I've been evangelizing in the wind for a very long time that cyber is a risk. And so, sometimes I think sectors are going to see the tougher love coming right now, which is more stick, because they're saying, we've been telling you this for quite some time. You can either get there or we're going to have to help make sure you do get there.
And contributing to what Norma said, different sectors are going to be different here. And something I found interesting in the National Cyber Strategy was the recognition that we've, in many sectors, defaulted to the user being responsible for this and trying to get more shared management of that.
And to your specific example, that the culture that needs to change for that to happen, for the electric grid to get more cybersecure, also includes the public utility commissions who set the rates that we all pay for electricity. Because I would argue, and talking to the utilities want to make these changes, but they want to be able to pass that off the ratepayers and collect more fees against it. If the public utility commissions are stuck setting rates based on 20th century risk rather than 21st century risk, they're creating risk that isn't the utility's fault, but sits there and we all own.
It is circular, though. The electric utility industry is the only industry that's allowed to write its own regulations. I mean, I hope everybody understands that. So when they say that the regulations are too robust or difficult, they're writing their own. There's not another single critical infrastructure sector that's allowed to do that.
Well, Norma, Bob, Henry, thanks for the insight this morning here. I think that is a wrap. Thank you all for attending and enjoy the rest of your RSA conference.
Thank you.